Lovely to speak to you again. This next podcast, our second podcast, going on to the subject of performance and playing for a public. For instance, one of the things I think is dreadfully important in the performance of every piece, whether it be modern, Baroque, or from the later periods, it doesn't matter. It's really one of the essential things for communicating music, and that is breathing. And what I've often found is the many performances just simply don't breathe. They absolutely go dead. And okay, I've had my experiences also, not always successful, sometimes that I didn't like it, but still we've got to find a way to do this. I've discovered for myself one or two things really help. For instance, many people, when they start to play, well, what am I going to play? Okay, let's take For Elise, everyone knows it. You see them do this. And so on. Wrong. I want to see something beforehand, and I say to people, instead of just going there like that and starting, do this. The thing is, by doing that small movement beforehand, you've done a very important thing. You've actually released your arm. You've relaxed it, possibly from the shoulder. Not only have you relaxed the arm, you've relaxed the wrist and the hand. So somehow you're connecting with the instrument. You're making, like what Alfred Cortot once said, something I love, make the finger an extension of the key. He liked that to be done basically with a more flat finger. And of course we know from Horowitz, he's always using that flat finger, or very often, and not always, of course, but sometimes. And that is in fact an extension of that key. And with that, you get very close contact with your instrument. There's one thing I've learned. To be able to communicate to a public, the first thing we've got to be able to do is communicate with our piano or whichever instrument we're playing. So the first thing, getting the breathing right. The amazing thing is, and this is one of the things which I think every philosopher in the past has discussed, about the consequence of cause and effect. All right, if you do something like that at the beginning, the chances are very strong that you'll keep on doing it in a natural way. Your arms will just want to go that way. And that's the wonderful thing about it. You don't have to always think, I must do that, or I must do this, or I must do that. No, you do it. And without really thinking too much. I believe in thinking. I certainly believe in thinking, but not always too much. But it depends on what we think. And that's the very beginning of a piece. So somehow that creates the cause to have an effect, and that effect will probably be a reaction on the way of playing the beginning. If it doesn't happen, it's as if a piece just starts cold. Of course, a conductor, he always makes something before the first beat. Same thing with a violinist. A concert master will always, or a violinist has to do something. We make an opposite movement to do an opposite thing. You go up so that you can go down. The funny thing is you can't go down if you haven't gone up. It sounds so silly, but it's a fact, isn't it? Anyway, I don't have to tell anyone that because everyone knows this. But then a few other things. By doing this, that makes your feeling for performing a whole piece different. You start to listen to where you can slightly slow down in a piece to bring it out a little bit more. For instance, moments with very complicated chords. Now, this is sometimes very much necessary in contemporary music. We have sometimes quite complicated passages which need to be made clear. And that means often, in my experience, a little fractional slowing down of the tempo. And I say fractional. It shouldn't be noticed as being a slowing down. It should be noticed as a sort of slightly broadening it. And to do this, to really make it come over, there's another point which I've often found is wrongly done, and that is long notes and rests. These two things suffer. People often, and we musicians, I've been guilty of it, I think everyone is guilty of it at certain times. We don't give enough time to the long notes. The long notes are always cut short. I think it was Johannes Brahms who said once, the most important part of a piece are the long notes and the second halves. The second halves of the long notes, listen to them. So he said something like that. I don't know the exact wording anymore, but it was something like that. And it's so simple and so important. Possibly the listener, that's possibly the only thing the listener who's not experienced hears. It's probably the long notes. That means the same thing applies to fermatas. When you've got a pause, and that's such an important moment, usually always a dreadfully important moment, that's somehow got to be prepared. We've got to somehow get the feeling of what's coming, although we shouldn't really know what's coming, because the listener may be hearing this piece for the first time. But the pause are so important. For instance, the pause, you get this sonata. That's an important moment. The most important moment I find there is that rest. It's often the case that a rest in music is the actual climax of a moment. There are different grades of rests. Some are lyrical, some are high intention, really very strong. I would say super strong, pretty bad language, but still something like that. They are dreadfully important. And these are moments which are often neglected. Some pianists will make a lot of movement at those moments. That might actually even destroy them. In my humble opinion, I think it often destroys it. But I don't really like too much of this business, and all this business. I'm a bit allergic. It's one of the things I've discovered I'm really allergic for. That and another thing, unrhythmical playing. Those things, they give me nightmares. So that's something I think we've got to always be careful about. But still, these fermatas, they must be given their time. But also, more important, they must be given the emotional, the strong feeling that's behind them. We've got to give the emotional, really the reason for a piece. That brings me to another very important point. Something that I think is not really discussed and worked on anywhere near as much as it should be. And that is every piece, well, let's say every good piece, has what I call an emotional background, and that's to be found in certain notes that come in the piece. There are notes which have a certain direction. They may be strong notes which give direction to a piece. For instance, if I go back to that Schubert sonata which we were discussing before, I gave a second example with an accent on the third beat, actually the second beat of the first measure. That was this accent here, and this accent here. Now, I understand it, because what does it do? It actually brings you to this long note, which is quite nice. It's pretty simple, and I think rather bad taste, because really basically the fact that Schubert plays these first two notes twice and then second time, so it begins there like the phrase begins there. He puts a slur over these notes, so that means that making this note stronger would probably be not so wise. Although it does bring you to this long chord here. Nice idea, but it doesn't really work correctly, I think. And I think we've got to sometimes think of that too. But it is, and that's why I'm mentioning it, it is a note that propels towards something. So it shouldn't be too little. So we've got to find a way to really keep the tension to move to that longer note. So if we go down and we play this too softly, then it sort of goes dead. It might be nice, but it's not more than nice. And if we give it the same level, then we come here, and then we've made it in a way that long note can actually last a little bit longer, not completely the same. So there was what my examples are from slightly varied tempos within even the same theme. I think that's dreadfully important for communicating a piece of music. So these things all together. First of all, communicating with the instrument, making it work, the finger communicating with the key, making sure that that is preferably a sort of extension of the arm. The arm, is an extension of the key, the other way around. Anyway, I think that's important. And that, together with what I mentioned about breathing, the way to start a piece, the way to keep it moving. And there are several things I would like to talk about in the coming podcast about what to do to make the piece really move right through from the beginning to the end. I think that's another subject, and really a very important subject we should discuss sometime. But we want to discuss so many things. Another thing I want to have time for is contemporary music. And we'll have that, I'm sure, in one of the coming podcasts. Thanks very much for watching.